San Luis Obispo, California. Originally incorporated in 1856, San Luis Obispo is one of California's oldest cities. Throughout its history, San Luis Obispo has been home to many different ethnic groups. One of these groups were the Chinese. Although they were once a prominent force, the Chinese influence in San Luis Obispo is hardly seen today. These facts made us start asking questions. What happened to the Chinese? Where did they go? And what happened to San Luis Obispo's Chinatown?
In the 1850s, the world had its eyes on California. Gold, gold, and gold. Chinese, in particular, was enticed by the lure of Gomsan, Gold Mountain, which occurred at the same time as the Taiping Rebellion. Harsh economic conditions imposed by the Qing government, natural calamities such as floods, and starvation contributed to the Chinese immigration at the time. By the 1890s, 10% of California's population was Chinese. It seems that the Chinese immigrants have finally hit gold, and thousands traveled across the Pacific. Many borrowed money for the passage. However, the conditions for the Chinese soon changed. Back in the 1850s, foreign miners law set high prices for licenses, while limiting the number given. Then, it was followed by forbidding the Chinese cola trade in 1862. In 1881, opium smoking became illegal in California. And finally, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was enforced. When all of these laws used to limit and discourage Chinese from taking up the white man's job, the number of Chinese immigrating started to decline. Similar patterns can be seen throughout California, and it is no different in the San Luis Obispo area. Discrimination was prominent as early as the 1850s, when Caucasian miners became jealous of the employed Chinese. The recession of 1873 did not help the situation either. The unemployed Caucasians at the time saw the Chinese as having a strange culture, language, and habits. 1879 was an especially hard time for the Chinese. During a special election called by the California governor on immigration, 154,638 voted against, and only 883 voted for the immigration of Chinese. All except for 5 people voted against Chinese immigration in the San Luis Obispo area. The same year, in San Miguel, Chin Lee was taken from his home and shot. Attacking Chinese alternative occupations that same year, the city of San Luis Obispo passed a law removing Chinese laundries from Higuera Street. Taking the last straw, all Chinese left San Miguel in 1880. During the mid-1880s, increasing violent acts and discriminating laws were passed. Caucasians in the Arroyo Grande area were forcing the Chinese out of town with threat of hanging for anyone who didn't leave the area. In 1888, Chinese were prevented from returning to China via the Scott Act. 1892, another law was passed. This time, the Chinese were forced to obtain certificates of residence through the Geary Act. Thus, the Chinese population of San Luis Obispo began the registration process in 1894. Through this tough discriminatory barrier, the Chinese of San Luis Obispo stood united. This was all made possible by one man.
Perhaps one of the most prominent figures in San Luis Obispo's Chinese culture and history was a man named Juan, but who most commonly went by his most popular nickname of Louis. Born near Canton in 1840, Louis immigrated to San Francisco in 1861 at the age of 21, and after almost 10 years spent mining for gold and taking what odd jobs came his way, he found himself in San Luis Obispo. Once here, he began work as a cook in the French Hotel, and soon after became the foreman and employment agent of all the Chinese who worked on the Pacific Coast Railroad, which ran from what is now Port San Luis to the town of Los Olivos, a span of about 55 miles. Once he had established himself on the Central Coast, Louis wasted no time in building his store, which still stands to this day on the corner of Palm Street and Choro Street, a mere few blocks from the historic Higuera Street. Not only did the Louis store serve as a market for Chinese foods and herbal remedies, but it also carried a number of what is described in his advertisements as Chinese and Japanese wares of all kinds, just the thing for holiday presents. The store also served as Louis' base of operations in his labor agency, which boasted Chinese labor contracted for on short notice, satisfaction guaranteed in all business transactions. Through his store, he contracted labor for the railroad, Cambria's quicksilver mines, and even the county roads leading over Cuesta Grade and south to Los Olivos. According to Lynn Landwehr, the store also served as a bank and post office to the ever-fluctuating Chinese population. Louis became such a prominent figure that when new Chinese laborers came to the Central Coast, according to his son Walter Louis, they would immediately make themselves known to Louis. Like Chinese laborers across the state of California, those that lived here in San Luis Obispo contributed a great deal to the transportation capabilities of the town. But unlike other areas of the state, laborers here provided a connection to the north that previously did not exist over the Cuesta Grade, and thus opened up channels for commerce and travel that previously did not exist. There is some debate, however, regarding the construction of the railroad passage over the grade. Of the two arguments, one states that it took about 2,000 Chinese 10 years to construct the 8 tunnels through the hillside of the formidable grade. Another argument, however, states that there is no photographic evidence to support the first, and that it was primarily white labor with the help of only a few Chinese. To this day, it is very difficult to discern which of the accounts is most accurate. Why then did the San Luis Obispo Chinatown effectively disintegrate? With such a booming business and active community, how did this small Chinatown reach such a state of decline? Where did Louis' compatriots go, and what caused them to leave? Unfortunately, a great deal of the influence to leave San Luis Obispo was provided by the town's white community. Bomb threats were made to Chinese laundries, laws were passed to prevent the Chinese from maintaining successful businesses, and numerous instances of prejudices have been recorded, particularly linked with blaming the Chinese for the increasing numbers of unemployed Caucasian workers. With so much strife, it makes sense that the Chinese would move away from the Central Coast. Such a small minority community would have been incredibly difficult to maintain with any hope of a content existence. So where then did the Chinese go? In the years surrounding the turn of the 20th century, there was a massive influx of Chinese into San Francisco, and many of the immigrants stayed within the city limits, contributing to the huge and prosperous Chinatown we see today. Although we lack the appropriate documentation or proof, it would make sense that the Chinese of San Luis Obispo, under such duress, would desire to find a place where they could be more comfortable with their ways of life. The Chinatowns of larger cities, particularly Los Angeles and San Francisco, would have provided such a cultural haven for the Chinese of San Luis Obispo, and being in such populated areas would have offered a greater range of labor opportunities to the incoming people. The racial animosity, in combination with the ever-changing population on the Central Coast, simply seems to have created an environment in which it was far easier to move on and find new communities than to remain and attempt to maintain their own.